Vivienne doesn't need anything substantial, my cousin Dominic said, barely glancing in my direction as he spread the estate documents across the mahogany table. She's never been part of the real family business anyway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That was 3 months ago at Thornfield Manor, my late grandfather's estate in the rolling hills of Ravenshollow. Little did they know that in exactly 93 days, those same documents would be rendered completely meaningless, and the lawyer sitting quietly in the corner would stand up to deliver news that would shatter every assumption they'd made about our family's legacy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Ashford family had always been complicated, but never more so than on that gray October morning when we gathered to discuss Grandfather Aldric's will. The massive stone manor that had housed 5 generations of Ashfords loomed over us like a silent witness to decades of family drama, its Gothic windows reflecting the storm clouds gathering outside. I'd driven up from my small apartment in Millbrook the night before, my ancient Honda making embarrassing sputtering sounds as it climbed the winding driveway past the perfectly manicured gardens. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Here I was, the supposed poor relation, arriving at one of the most magnificent estates in all of Westmere County, in a car that was held together by hope and duct tape. The irony of it all would have made me laugh if I wasn't so nervous about what was coming. Thornfield Manor had always felt like a museum to me rather than a home. Every room was filled with priceless antiques, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual salary. The library alone contained first editions worth millions, and the wine cellar held bottles that dated back to the 1800s. It was the kind of place where you instinctively lowered your voice and watched where you stepped. My cousins, however, moved through these halls like they owned them, which, to be fair, they all assumed they soon would. Dominic Ashford Blackthorne, my Uncle Reginald's son, had arrived the evening before in his pristine silver Bentley, fresh from closing another multi-million-dollar deal at his investment firm in Kensington Heights. Everything about him screamed old money confidence, from his perfectly tailored Savile Row suit to his Oxford accent that somehow managed to make even casual conversations sound like a board meeting. His sister Cordelia had flown in from her penthouse in Morganshire on the family's private jet, taking a break from her high society charity circuit to attend what she clearly viewed as a formality. She glided through the manor in designer clothes that cost more than my rent, her diamond jewelry catching the light from the crystal chandeliers as she gestured dramatically while discussing her latest art acquisition. Then there was my other cousin, Percival, Uncle Edmund's golden boy, who'd made his fortune in tech before he was 30, and now spent his time collecting vintage cars and attending galas. He'd driven up in what I later learned was a limited edition McLaren, because apparently regular supercars weren't exclusive enough for the Ashford family standards. And finally, there was Aunt Beatrice, grandfather's youngest daughter, who had married into European nobility and never let anyone forget it. She swept into Thornfield like she was gracing us peasants with her presence, speaking in that affected continental accent she'd developed after living in Valdoria for the past 20 years. Then there was me, Vivienne Ashford, the family afterthought. While my cousins had all followed the traditional Ashford path of prestigious universities, advantageous marriages, and lucrative careers, I had chosen a different route. After graduating from Millbrook Community College with a degree in social work, I'd spent the last 15 years working with underprivileged families in the city's most challenging neighborhoods. My apartment above Mrs. Calloway's bakery wasn't much to look at, but it was home, and more importantly, it was mine. The family had never quite known what to make of me. I didn't fit into their world of country club memberships and charity galas. I drove an old car, shopped at thrift stores, and had never owned a piece of jewelry worth more than $50. To them, I was living proof that sometimes the Ashford bloodline produced anomalies. Poor Vivienne, they'd whisper at family gatherings, such a waste of potential. What they didn't understand, what they'd never bothered to try to understand, was that I wasn't poor by circumstance. I was deliberately living simply. But explaining that to people who measured success by the size of their trust funds and the thread count of their sheets seemed pointless. So when Grandfather Aldric passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 94, I wasn't surprised that the family seemed to view me as more of an obligation than a beneficiary. They invited me to the reading of the will. Of course, it would have been scandalous not to, but their body language made it clear that they considered my presence a mere formality. As I pulled up to Thornfield Manor that morning, watching my cousin's luxury vehicles gleaming in the circular driveway like a showroom display, I couldn't help but feel like an intruder at my own family gathering. The October mist clung to the moors beyond the estate, and the ancient oak trees that lined the property seemed to whisper secrets that had been kept for generations. I had no idea that some of those secrets were about to be revealed in the most spectacular way possible. The lawyer, a distinguished gentleman named Mr. Aldwin Harwick from the prestigious firm of Harwick, Pemberton and Associates, had arrived precisely at 10 o'clock in his understated but expensive Mercedes. He carried with him a leather briefcase that contained documents that would soon turn our family's world upside down. But as I climbed the stone steps to the massive front door, listening to the familiar creak of the iron hinges that had welcomed and dismissed Ashfords for over 2 centuries, I was simply hoping to get through the morning with my dignity intact. I had absolutely no idea that I was about to inherit everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The moment I stepped into the grand salon, I could feel the weight of generations watching me. The oil paintings of long-dead Ashfords seemed to peer down from their gilded frames with the same mixture of disappointment and resignation that I'd grown accustomed to seeing in my living relatives' eyes. Dominic was already holding court near the massive stone fireplace, regaling anyone within earshot about his latest acquisition. "The penthouse in Kensington Heights closed yesterday," he announced, swirling what I assumed was Grandfather's most expensive brandy in a crystal tumbler. $42 million, cash deal. The previous owner was some oil executive from the Emirates. Apparently, he couldn't appreciate proper British architecture. He paused dramatically, waiting for the appropriate murmurs of admiration from his audience. "Of course, I'll be gutting the entire interior. Can't have someone else's taste contaminating the space." Cordelia, draped elegantly across a velvet chaise lounge that probably cost more than my annual salary, barely looked up from her phone. "How quaint, darling. I assume you'll be hiring that dreadful firm that did the Pemberton estate. They completely ruined the original moldings." "Hardly," Dominic scoffed. "I'm flying in architects from Milan, the same team that redesigned the Duke of Ravencrest's country home last year." I settled into a wingback chair near the far window, hoping to blend into the furniture. From this vantage point, I could observe the family dynamics without drawing too much attention to myself, a skill I'd perfected over years of these gatherings. Percival emerged from the library carrying what appeared to be a first edition of something valuable. His attention split between the book and his phone. Even in casual conversation, he managed to broadcast his success. "Sorry, had to take that call. The team in Singapore is finalizing the acquisition of that fintech startup. Should clear about $200 million once we integrate their platform with our existing infrastructure." He finally noticed me sitting by the window. "Oh, Vivienne! Didn't see you there? How's the charity work going?" The way he said charity work made it sound like I was collecting coins in a bucket on street corners, rather than running intervention programs for at-risk youth. But I had learned long ago that correcting my family's misconceptions about my career was like trying to explain color to someone who'd been blind from birth. "It's going well, thank you," I replied simply. "Still in that little place above the bakery in Millbrook?" Cordelia chimed in without looking up from her phone, her tone suggesting she was discussing someone's unfortunate medical condition. "I am." "How authentic of you," she murmured, finally gracing me with her attention. "Though I suppose someone has to live among the common people. It's very anthropological." Aunt Beatrice made her entrance at that moment, sweeping into the room like she was arriving at a state dinner. Her burgundy Hermes coat was artfully draped over her shoulders, and her pearls, which she claimed were a gift from some minor European royal, caught the light streaming through the Gothic windows. "Darlings," she announced in her practiced continental accent. "So sorry to keep you waiting." The helicopter from Heathrow was delayed. Something about air traffic from some dreadful commercial flights. She surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, her gaze sliding over me as if I were part of the furniture. "Now then, where is this mysterious lawyer? I do hope we can conclude this business efficiently. The Count is expecting me in Valdoria tomorrow evening for the Harvest Festival, and I simply cannot be late." Mr. Harwick chose that moment to enter, carrying his leather briefcase with the solemnity of a priest bearing sacred relics. He was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer who'd spent 40 years managing the affairs of Britain's wealthiest families, impeccably dressed, meticulously groomed, and possessed of the kind of quiet authority that commanded instant respect. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice carrying easily across the large room. "Thank you all for gathering today. I know these circumstances are difficult, but I believe we can handle Lord Ashford's final wishes with the dignity and respect they deserve." The family began arranging themselves around the massive mahogany table that dominated the center of the room. It was the same table where Ashfords had conducted business for over a century, its surface scarred with the marks of countless documents signed, deals struck, and fortunes made or lost. Dominic naturally assumed the position at the head of the table, grandfather's chair, settling into it as if he'd been born to occupy that spot. Cordelia arranged herself to his right, while Percival took the left. Aunt Beatrice chose a position that allowed her to maintain her regal bearing while still having a clear view of the proceedings. And then there was the question of where I should sit. Inhai. The pause was subtle but unmistakable. There was clearly an established hierarchy here, and I wasn't part of it. After a moment that stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable, Dominic gestured vaguely toward the far end of the table. "Vivienne, perhaps you'd be comfortable down there," he suggested, indicating a chair that was close enough to technically be included, but far enough away to make my secondary status abundantly clear. I took my designated seat without comment, watching as Mr. Harwick arranged his documents with methodical precision. The lawyer's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught him glancing at each family member with the kind of calculating look that suggested he knew far more about our dynamics than he was letting on. "Before we begin," Dominic announced, clearly viewing himself as the family spokesman, "I think I speak for all of us when I say how grateful we are for Grandfather's wisdom in structuring his affairs so traditionally. The Ashford legacy has always been about maintaining continuity, ensuring that our family's influence and resources continue to serve the greater good." He gestured grandly around the room, encompassing centuries of accumulated wealth and power. "Thornfield Manor has been the heart of our family for generations, and I'm confident that Grandfather's will reflects his understanding of who is best positioned to carry that legacy forward." The others nodded in solemn agreement, their expressions suggesting they were attending a ceremony where the outcome was already known and approved. Cordelia even allowed herself a small smile, perhaps already mentally redecorating the manor to suit her elevated tastes. "The Ashford name carries weight in this county," Percival added. "In all of Westmere, really. Grandfather understood the importance of keeping our holdings consolidated, maintaining our influence in the right circles." "Precisely," Aunt Beatrice agreed, her jewelry sparkling as she nodded emphatically. "Dear Papa always said that diluting family resources was the fastest way to diminish family power. Much better to keep everything concentrated among those who truly understand the responsibility." I noticed how they kept using words like responsibility and legacy and understanding, as if inheriting money required some special qualification that I clearly lacked. Their certainty was almost admirable in its completeness. They had no doubt whatsoever that they were the natural heirs to everything Grandfather had built. Mr. Harwick cleared his throat gently, drawing everyone's attention. "Shall we begin, then?" The family settled back in their chairs with the satisfied air of people attending a formality that would soon confirm what they already knew to be true. Dominic adjusted his cufflinks. Cordelia checked her manicure, and Percival glanced at his watch as if he had more important places to be. None of them bothered to look at me. They had no idea that in the next few minutes, their entire world was about to crumble. Mr. Harwick opened his briefcase with deliberate care, and I watched my family's expressions shift from casual confidence to eager anticipation. They leaned forward slightly, like vultures preparing to feast, their eyes fixed on the thick manila envelope he withdrew from the leather interior. "Before we begin with the formal reading," Mr. Harwick said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, "perhaps we should address some of the practical matters regarding the estate's immediate management." Dominic straightened in Grandfather's chair, clearly relishing what he saw as his moment to step into the role of family patriarch. "Of course. I've already spoken with my financial advisors about the most efficient way to handle the transition. We'll want to minimize tax implications while ensuring the estate's assets remain properly diversified. I've also been in touch with Sotheby's," Cordelia added, her voice taking on the brisk, businesslike tone she used when discussing her art acquisitions. "They're prepared to conduct a full appraisal of the collection within the week. Some of the pieces in the East Wing haven't been properly valued in decades." I felt a small pang at that. The East Wing housed Grandfather's study, filled with his beloved books and the modest paintings he'd collected, not for their monetary value, but because they brought him joy. The idea of Sotheby's representatives tramping through that sacred space, with calculators and clipboards, felt like a violation. "Excellent thinking," Percival chimed in, pulling out his phone and making notes with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple business deals simultaneously. "I've already had preliminary discussions with estate management firms. We'll need professional oversight for the properties in Scotland and Ireland, and the London flat will require specialized handling given its location in Belgravia." Aunt Beatrice waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I wouldn't worry too much about the London property. The Count has been looking for a suitable pied-à-terre for when we're in town for the season. I'm sure we can work out some arrangement." They continued discussing the division of assets with the casual ease of people deciding how to split a restaurant bill, each assumption building upon the last until they'd constructed an entire future around their collective certainty. I sat quietly at my end of the table, marveling at how thoroughly they'd managed to plan the distribution of an inheritance they hadn't actually received yet. "What about the staff?" Cordelia asked, her tone suggesting she was discussing the disposition of furniture rather than people's livelihoods. "Mrs. Whitmore has been here for 30 years, hasn't she? And that gardener, what's his name, Edmund?" "Tobias," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down. They all turned to look at me with mild surprise, as if they'd forgotten I was there. "I beg your pardon?" Cordelia said. "The head gardener. His name is Tobias Hartwell. He's been maintaining the grounds for 35 years, actually. His father worked here before him." Dominic looked at me with the kind of patronizing smile one might give a child who'd just shared an irrelevant but harmless observation. "Right. Well, I'm sure we'll be able to arrange something suitable for the existing personnel. Though obviously we'll need to evaluate whether the current staffing level is appropriate for our needs." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. These people, Mrs. Whitmore, Tobias, the cook, Mrs. Pemberley, the groundskeepers, they weren't just employees to Grandfather. They were family in all but name. He'd attended their children's weddings, helped pay for their grandchildren's education, ensured they had comfortable retirements planned. The idea of my cousins evaluating their worth like they were outdated equipment made my stomach turn. "Of course, we'll need to be practical about expenses," Aunt Beatrice said, examining her manicure with studied nonchalance. "I'm sure dear Papa was far too generous with the help. It's not sustainable in the current economic climate." "Absolutely," Percival agreed, still tapping away on his phone. "We'll want to streamline operations, eliminate redundancies. The estate can probably function with half the current staff if we implement proper efficiency measures." I wanted to speak up, to remind them that these weren't efficiency measures they were discussing, but real people with families and mortgages and lives that extended far beyond the borders of Thornfield Manor. But I knew from experience that any objection I raised would be dismissed as naive idealism from someone who didn't understand how these things worked. Mr. Harwick cleared his throat softly, and I caught something in his expression, a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction of the conversation. But he remained professionally neutral, continuing to arrange his documents while my family carved up their assumed inheritance, like conquistadors dividing newly discovered territories. "I do think we should discuss Vivienne's situation," Dominic said suddenly, his tone taking on the kind of forced kindness that made my skin crawl. Obviously, Grandfather would have wanted us to ensure she's provided for. The way he said provided for made it sound like they were discussing arrangements for a family pet. "Of course," Cordelia agreed, finally giving me her full attention for the first time that morning. "I'm sure there will be some sort of modest provision, perhaps enough for a small flat somewhere more appropriate." "The guest cottage has been empty since the Hendersons retired," Aunt Beatrice suggested. "It would keep her close to family while giving her some independence, much more suitable than that dreadful place above the bakery." I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm quite happy where I am." "Darling," Cordelia said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "you can't seriously want to spend your life in Millbrook. There's nothing there for someone of your background." "My work is there," I replied evenly. "The families I help, the programs I run." "Oh, that's very noble," Dominic interrupted. "But surely you understand that with a proper inheritance, you wouldn't need to work at all. You could pursue more suitable interests, perhaps take some courses, learn about art or literature, become the kind of woman who could actually contribute to family gatherings." The implication was clear. My current life was an embarrassment they were prepared to help me correct, assuming I was willing to be molded into their vision of what an Ashford woman should be. "I've always thought you had potential," Aunt Beatrice added with the air of someone bestowing a great compliment. "You simply need guidance, the right wardrobe, the right social connections. I could introduce you to some lovely young men in Valdoria. Nothing too ambitious, of course, but someone appropriate for your station." "My station?" I repeated. "Well, naturally you'll never move in the same circles as Dominic or Cordelia," she explained patiently, as if stating an obvious fact. "But there are perfectly respectable middle-tier positions in society, junior diplomatic wives, perhaps, or the spouses of successful merchants. People who would appreciate your earnest qualities." I marveled at their ability to insult me while genuinely believing they were being helpful. In their minds, they were offering me a path to a better life, rescuing me from my own poor choices and limited ambitions. The fact that I might actually prefer my current existence was literally incomprehensible to them. "Of course, all of this depends on Vivienne being sensible about her expectations," Percival said, not looking up from his phone. "I'm sure Grandfather was generous within reason, but it's important to be realistic. A trust fund of £50,000 properly invested could provide a modest supplemental income for life." "50,000?" Dominic laughed. "Percy, you're being overly optimistic. I'd expect something closer to 25. Grandfather was sentimental, but he wasn't foolish." They continued discussing the size of my assumed inheritance with the same casual interest they might show in predicting the weather, each estimate lower than the last. By the time they finished, they'd settled on a figure that would barely cover my rent for 2 years, accompanied by a long list of conditions about how I should spend it. "The important thing," Aunt Beatrice concluded, "is that we help Vivienne understand how to manage whatever she receives responsibly. Perhaps a financial advisor, someone who could ensure she doesn't squander it on more of those dreadful social programs." Mr. Harwick had remained silent throughout this entire discussion, his expression growing more and more unreadable with each passing minute. I found myself studying his face, searching for some clue about what he was thinking, as he listened to my family dissect my life and future with such casual dismissiveness. Finally, he spoke. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we should proceed with the actual reading of the will." The room fell silent, and I felt the sudden weight of anticipation settle over us like a heavy blanket. My family straightened in their chairs, their expressions shifting from casual certainty to formal attention. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the official confirmation of what they already knew to be true. None of them looked at me. They didn't need to. As far as they were concerned, my part in this story was already written, a brief footnote in the grand narrative of Ashford family wealth and power. They had no idea they were about to discover just how wrong they could be. Mr. Hardwick reached into his briefcase and withdrew a second envelope, this one sealed with the distinctive crimson wax that bore Grandfather's personal seal, a raven perched atop a crown, the ancient symbol of the Ashford family. The weight of history seemed to settle over the room as he broke the seal with ceremonial precision. "Before I read the primary document," he said, his voice carrying a gravity that made everyone lean forward, "Lord Ashford left specific instructions for me to share some background information that he felt was essential for understanding his final wishes." Dominic nodded approvingly. Grandfather always was thorough. I imagine he wanted to explain his reasoning for the traditional distribution of assets. "Indeed," Mr. Hardwick replied, though something in his tone made me glance at him more carefully. He was particularly concerned about ensuring that his true intentions were understood, especially regarding certain misconceptions that had developed within the family over the years. "Misconceptions?" Aunt Beatrice asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yes. It seems Lord Ashford had become aware that there were certain assumptions being made about family members' circumstances, assumptions that were not entirely accurate." The lawyer paused, his eyes scanning the room with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades delivering news both welcome and unwelcome to families like ours. I noticed that his gaze lingered on me for just a moment longer than the others, but the expression on his face remained professionally neutral. "For instance," he continued, "Lord Ashford was quite interested in the recent developments regarding charitable organizations in Millbrook. He followed the local news quite closely, you know." "Oh yes," Cordelia said dismissively. "Grandfather always had a soft spot for those little community projects. Very sweet of him, really, though hardly substantial in the grand scheme of things." Mr. Hardwick's lips twitched slightly. "He was particularly impressed by the Millbrook Youth Intervention Program. Are any of you familiar with it?" The family exchanged glances, their expressions politely blank. Percival shrugged. "Can't say I've heard of it. Is it one of those government initiatives?" "Not exactly," Mr. Hardwick replied. "It's actually a privately funded program that has dramatically reduced juvenile crime in the Millbrook district over the past decade. The success rate has been quite remarkable, an 87% reduction in repeat offenses among participants." "How nice," Aunt Beatrice said absently, clearly wondering where this conversation was leading. "The program has been so successful, in fact, that it recently received recognition from the Crown. The director was invited to Buckingham Palace last month to receive a special commendation for services to community welfare." I felt my cheeks burning and kept my eyes fixed on my hands folded in my lap. That invitation had been one of the proudest moments of my career, but I'd never mentioned it to my family. What would have been the point? They would have either dismissed it as insignificant or assumed I was exaggerating. "The director of this program," Mr. Hardwick continued, "has also been featured in several national publications. The Times did a rather extensive profile about innovative approaches to social work. The Guardian wrote about sustainable funding models for community programs. And just last week, the BBC featured the program in a documentary about grassroots solutions to urban problems." Dominic was beginning to look impatient. "This is all very admirable, I'm sure, but what does it have to do with Grandfather's will?" "Lord Ashford was quite proud of the program," Mr. Hardwick said. "He made several anonymous donations over the years, actually. Quite substantial ones. He believed very strongly in supporting what he called practical compassion, programs that didn't just talk about helping people, but actually produced measurable results. I felt a flutter of surprise. I'd known that the program had received several large anonymous donations, but I'd never suspected they came from Grandfather. The money had made it possible to expand our services, to hire additional counselors, to provide educational scholarships for the kids we worked with. He was also quite interested in the program's financial management, Mr. Harwick continued. The director has apparently managed to leverage private donations to secure matching government funds, creating a sustainable revenue stream that has tripled the program's budget over 5 years. Lord Ashford found this particularly impressive, given his own background in financial planning. Grandfather always appreciated good business sense, Percival agreed, still clearly puzzled about the relevance of this discussion. The program's success has attracted attention from other counties as well. Apparently, there are plans to expand the model throughout Westmere and into neighboring districts. The director has been invited to speak at several universities about innovative funding strategies for social programs. Those speaking engagements had been another source of quiet pride for me. Standing in lecture halls at Oxford and Cambridge, sharing our methods with students and professors who were genuinely interested in creating change. It was a far cry from the dismissive reception my work received at family gatherings. Lord Ashford was particularly intrigued by the director's background, Mr. Harwick said, his voice taking on a tone that suggested he was approaching something significant. Apparently, this individual comes from a rather privileged background but chose to dedicate their life to serving others. He found this choice both admirable and somewhat familiar. I felt the weight of several gazes turning in my direction, but when I looked up, my family's expressions were still more confused than enlightened. The director has consistently refused opportunities for higher-paying positions, the lawyer continued. Turned down offers from major nonprofits, declined consulting contracts with government agencies, always chose to stay focused on the work itself rather than the potential for personal advancement. How very noble, Cordelia said, though her tone suggested she found such behavior incomprehensible rather than admirable. Lord Ashford apparently respected this dedication immensely. He told me once that he wished more young people understood the difference between building a career and building a legacy. Aunt Beatrice shifted uncomfortably in her chair. That's all very interesting, but surely we can discuss Grandfather's philanthropic interests after we've handled the more pressing matters of the estate? Mr. Harwick nodded slowly. Of course. But he was quite specific that I should mention his admiration for people who choose substance over appearance, who measure success by impact rather than income. A lovely sentiment, Dominic said, with barely concealed impatience. But if we could perhaps focus on the practical matters. He was also fascinated by the concept of hidden value, Mr. Harwick interrupted gently. People and things that might appear ordinary on the surface, but possess extraordinary worth when properly understood. There was something in the way he said this that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I found myself studying his face more intently, searching for clues about what he really meant. For example, he continued, he owned several pieces of art that were purchased decades ago for modest sums but have since appreciated dramatically in value, not because they became more beautiful, but because the world finally recognized what was always there. Yes, we understand about investment appreciation, Percival said. Could we perhaps move on to the actual provisions of the will? Certainly, Mr. Harwick replied. But first, he wanted me to mention one more thing about the Millbrook Youth Intervention Program. The room had grown noticeably tense, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was Mr. Harwick's insistence on dwelling on what they clearly viewed as an irrelevant topic. Or perhaps it was some subconscious recognition that this detailed discussion was leading somewhere they weren't prepared to go. The program was founded 15 years ago by someone who invested their own modest inheritance to get it started. Someone who could have chosen a comfortable life but instead chose a meaningful one. Someone who has consistently put the needs of vulnerable children ahead of their own financial security. He paused, letting his words settle over the room like dust motes in the afternoon light streaming through the Gothic windows. Lord Ashford found this particularly moving because, as he put it reminded him of the values that built the Ashford fortune in the first place. Not the accumulation of wealth for its own sake, but the use of resources to create something lasting and valuable. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses in our conversation. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of people waiting for expected news, but the uneasy stillness of people beginning to suspect that their expectations might be wrong. He also mentioned, Mr. Hardwick added, consulting his notes with deliberate care, that he was particularly proud to see an Ashford carrying on the family tradition of using privilege responsibly. An Ashford? Aunt Beatrice repeated, her voice suddenly sharp with attention. Oh, yes, Mr. Hardwick said, glancing around the table with an expression that had become decidedly less neutral. The director of the Millbrook Youth Intervention Program is, of course, Miss Vivienne Ashford. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the old manor house settling around us, the whisper of wind through the ancient oak trees outside, the distant sound of Mrs. Whitmore moving about in the kitchen below. My family stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief, as if Mr. Hardwick had just announced that I was secretly a space alien. But the real revelation was still to come. Dominic was the first to break the stunned silence, his voice carrying a note of forced joviality that didn't quite mask his underlying discomfort. Well, that's wonderful, Vivienne. We had no idea you were involved in something so extensive. The way he said extensive made it clear he was struggling to reconcile the impressive program Mr. Hardwick had described with his mental image of my supposedly insignificant life. I could practically see him trying to minimize the achievement even as he processed it. Yes, how lovely, Cordelia chimed in, her smile bright and entirely artificial. Though I must say, darling, you've been rather modest about your little project. Why didn't you ever mention receiving awards and whatnot? My little project? I repeated quietly. Well, you know what I mean, she said with a dismissive wave. Community work is so important, of course, but it's not as though you're running a real business or anything substantial like that. Aunt Beatrice leaned forward, her expression taking on the patronizing concern of someone addressing a child who'd shown them a drawing they'd made with crayons. Darling, it's quite admirable that you've found ways to keep yourself busy, but surely you understand the difference between charity work and actual professional achievement. I felt something cold and sharp twist in my stomach. Even when presented with concrete evidence of my success, national recognition, government commendations, university speaking engagements, they couldn't bring themselves to view it as legitimate. In their minds, anything that didn't generate immediate financial profit was merely an elaborate hobby. The BBC documentary, I said evenly, featured our program as a model for urban crime reduction. The methodology we developed is being implemented in 12 cities across England. Oh, how nice, Percival said absently, his attention already drifting back to his phone. Though I suppose government programs like that come and go, don't they? Not really the sort of thing you can build a secure future on. It's not a government program, I replied, my voice growing sharper despite my efforts to remain calm. It's privately funded through a combination of individual donations, corporate partnerships, and matching grants that I secured through strategic fundraising. Strategic fundraising, Dominic repeated with a slight chuckle. That's very entrepreneurial of you, cousin. Though I imagine the sums involved are rather different from what those of us in actual finance deal with on a daily basis. The condescension in his voice was like a physical blow. Here was a man who'd never created anything, never built something from nothing, never spent sleepless nights worrying about whether there would be enough money to keep vulnerable kids off the streets. And he had the audacity to dismiss my work because it didn't fit his narrow definition of success. The program's annual budget is currently £800,000, I said quietly. That got their attention. Percival actually looked up from his phone, and Cordelia's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment. 800,000? Aunt Beatrice repeated, her voice taking on a slightly higher pitch. For a community program? We serve over 2,000 at-risk youth annually, I explained. We provide counseling, educational support, job training, and family intervention services. The program has a full-time staff of 32 people and maintains partnerships with 15 local schools. Well, Dominic said, clearly struggling to maintain his dismissive tone in the face of numbers that were larger than he'd expected. That's certainly more substantial than we realized. Though, of course, managing a small nonprofit is hardly comparable to handling real estate portfolios worth hundreds of millions. Or international investment strategies, Percival added, apparently feeling the need to reassert his superiority. The Singapore acquisition I mentioned earlier, that deal alone involved more capital than your entire program will see in a decade. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Even when forced to acknowledge that my work was more significant than they'd assumed, they couldn't resist immediately diminishing it by comparison to their own achievements. It was as if they were physically incapable of allowing me to have worth, without first establishing their own dominance. "Of course, we're very proud of you," Cordelia said, her tone dripping with the kind of false warmth that made my skin crawl. "It's so important to have hobbies that give your life meaning, especially when you don't have the pressures of real responsibility." "Real responsibility?" I asked. "Well, yes," she said, gesturing around the room. "Managing actual wealth, maintaining family properties, handling investment portfolios, the sorts of obligations that come with genuine financial success. Your little program is lovely, but it's not as though you're responsible for preserving generational wealth or maintaining our family's position in society." I stared at her, marveling at her ability to take my life's work that had literally saved lives, kept kids out of prison, reunited families, and dismiss it as a hobby simply because it didn't involve managing inherited money. "The difference," Aunt Beatrice explained with the patience of someone educating a slow child, "is scale and impact. What you're doing is very sweet, very local, but it doesn't really affect anything important. We deal with decisions that influence entire markets, shape policy, determine the economic future of regions." "Exactly," Dominic agreed, warming to the theme. "When I close a deal, it affects property values across entire districts. When Percy acquires a company, it impacts international markets. When Cordelia makes an art purchase, it influences cultural trends. That's real power, real influence." "What you're doing," Percival added, not looking up from whatever he was typing on his phone, "is essentially advanced social work. Admirable in its way, I suppose, but not really in the same category as what the rest of us do." The casual dismissal of everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed for, hit me like a physical blow. But what made it worse was the genuine bewilderment in their voices, as if they truly couldn't understand why I might find their attitude offensive. "Your heart is in the right place," Cordelia continued, "but you have to understand that playing with grant money and helping a few troubled children isn't the same as managing real wealth and real responsibility." "Playing with grant money?" I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, you know what I mean," she said with an exasperated sigh. "Government funding, charitable donations, it's all very nice, but it's not your money, is it? You're essentially playing with other people's resources. The rest of us have built actual fortunes, created real value." I felt something snap inside me, a carefully maintained composure that had been holding back years of accumulated frustration and hurt. But before I could respond, Mr. Harwick cleared his throat with a sound that somehow managed to convey both disapproval and anticipation. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carrying a new edge that made everyone turn to look at him, "we should discuss exactly what constitutes real responsibility in Lord Ashford's view." "Of course," Dominic said, clearly eager to move past what he saw as an awkward digression into my insignificant affairs. Grandfather understood the burden of managing substantial wealth. He knew it required experience, judgment, the kind of financial acumen that comes from actual business success. "Indeed," Mr. Harwick replied, and there was something in his tone that made the hair on my arm stand up. He had very specific thoughts about who in the family had demonstrated the judgment and character necessary to handle such responsibility. "Naturally," Aunt Beatrice said, smoothing her skirt with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own worthiness. The family assets need to be in capable hands, people who understand how to preserve and grow wealth rather than simply spend it on charitable causes. He was particularly interested, Mr. Harwick continued, in distinguishing between those who had inherited their advantages and those who had actually created something meaningful with their opportunities. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, less expectant, more uneasy. I noticed that Mr. Harwick's expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something that looked almost like anticipation, as if he was about to deliver news he'd been looking forward to sharing. Lord Ashford left quite detailed notes about his observations of family members over the years, he said, reaching into his briefcase and withdrawing another document. He was particularly concerned about what he termed the difference between stewardship and exploitation. Exploitation? Percival asked, finally giving the conversation his full attention. Oh yes, Mr. Harwick said, his voice now carrying unmistakable satisfaction. He had quite a lot to say about that. I looked around the table at my family's faces, watching as their expressions shifted from confidence to confusion to the first stirrings of genuine unease. For the first time since we'd sat down, they seemed to be realizing that this conversation might not be going exactly where they'd expected. But they still had no idea what was coming. Mr. Harwick opened the new document with deliberate slowness, and I could see that it was covered in Grandfather's distinctive handwriting, the careful, precise script he'd maintained even in his final years. The sight of those familiar letters sent a pang of grief through me that I hadn't expected. Lord Ashford was quite meticulous about documenting his thoughts, the lawyer said, adjusting his spectacles. He spent considerable time observing family dynamics, particularly during gatherings like this one. Dominic shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Grandfather always was very analytical about family matters. Indeed. He kept detailed notes about conversations, behaviors, and what he termed revealing moments. He was particularly interested in how family members treated those they perceived as having less power or status. A flush crept up Cordelia's neck, though she maintained her composure. Papa was always very concerned with proper behavior. Standards have fallen so much in recent years. He was also quite concerned, Mr. Harwick continued, with what he observed regarding the management of existing family resources. He made some rather pointed observations about recent financial decisions made by various family members. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Percival's fingers stilled on his phone, and Aunt Beatrice's hand moved instinctively to her pearl necklace, a gesture I'd learned to recognize as a sign of her nervousness. I'm not sure what you mean, Dominic said carefully. Mr. Harwick consulted the handwritten notes. For instance, he was quite interested in the financing arrangements for your Jackson Hole property, Mr. Ashford Blackthorn. Particularly the creative use of family trust funds that were originally designated for estate maintenance. The color drained from Dominic's face so quickly I thought he might faint. Those were legitimate business expenses, investment diversification. Ah, yes, Mr. Harwick said, turning a page. He wrote extensively about investment diversification, particularly your sister's art acquisitions, that were charged to various family accounts as, quote, cultural preservation expenses. Cordelia's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly. Those purchases were for the family collection. They'll appreciate in value. The Monet that currently hangs in your Morganshire penthouse? Mr. Harwick asked mildly. The one purchased with funds from the estate's educational trust? Lord Ashford noted that it hasn't been to Thornfield Manor even once since its acquisition 3 years ago. It requires climate-controlled storage, she said weakly, as does the Picasso in your London flat, and the Van Gogh in your country house, all purchased with family funds, all somehow requiring storage in your private residences. I watched my cousins with growing fascination. These were people who had spent the morning discussing my modest lifestyle with condescending amusement, and now they were being confronted with evidence of their own financial improprieties. The irony was almost too delicious to bear. Lord Ashford was also quite curious about the consulting fees paid to various family members' companies. Mr. Hardwick continued relentlessly. Mr. Percival's technology firm, for instance, has received over £2 million in the past 5 years for, quote, digital infrastructure consulting for family properties. Percival's jaw tightened. Those were legitimate services. Estate modernization is crucial for maintaining property values. Yes, he noted your concern for property values, particularly your recommendation to sell the tenant farms in Scotland to a development company that, upon investigation, turned out to be majority-owned by your wife's investment group. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as I watched my family's carefully constructed facades crumbling in real time. These were the people who had spent years lecturing me about responsibility and proper financial management, and they had been systematically looting the family estate for their own benefit. There seems to be some misunderstanding, Aunt Beatrice said, her continental accent wavering slightly. These were all approved transactions, properly documented. Oh, they were documented, Mr. Hardwick agreed. Lord Ashford was quite thorough about documentation. He also documented the vacation expenses charged to family accounts. The private jet trips to Valdoria, for instance. 7 trips last year alone, at a cost of £40,000 each, all charged as quote, state business, despite being personal vacations. I was representing family interests in Valdoria, she protested. Cultural exchanges, maintaining international connections. At luxury resorts? Mr. Hardwick asked. He has quite detailed receipts here. Spa treatments, private yacht charters, designer shopping expeditions, all somehow classified as diplomatic expenses for the family. I felt a mixture of vindication and horror washing over me. These were people who had dismissed my life's work as playing with other people's money, while they had been literally stealing from their own family for years. The hypocrisy was staggering. This is highly irregular, Dominic said, his voice taking on the bluster of a man desperately trying to regain control of a situation that was spiraling away from him. Grandfather's private papers have no bearing on the legal distribution of his estate. Actually, Mr. Hardwick said, his voice taking on a new hardness, they have quite a lot of bearing. Lord Ashford was very specific about wanting his observations to be part of the formal record. He felt it was important for everyone to understand exactly why he made the decisions he did. What decisions? Cordelia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Hardwick reached into his briefcase one more time and withdrew what was clearly the actual will. A thick, formal document bound in dark blue leather with the Ashford family seal embossed in gold. He placed it on the table with the gravity of someone handling a sacred text. Lord Ashford spent the last 3 years of his life revising his testamentary arrangements, he said. He made the final changes just 6 months before his death, and he was very specific about wanting the full context of his decisions to be understood. The full context? Percival repeated. Yes. He felt that simply reading the distribution of assets wouldn't adequately convey his reasoning. He wanted everyone to understand that his decisions were based on careful observation of character, integrity, and what he termed faithful stewardship of family resources. The lawyer's eyes moved around the table, lingering on each face with the precision of a surgeon examining a patient. He was particularly concerned about the difference between those who viewed family wealth as a responsibility to be honored and those who viewed it as a resource to be exploited. My phone chose that moment to buzz with an incoming text. Without thinking, I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Dr. Helena Morrison, the Director of Social Services for Millbrook County. Vivienne, just wanted to let you know the Minister of Health's office called. They want to discuss expanding your program model nationally. Could mean £12 million in funding over 5 years. Congratulations. I quickly silenced the phone, but not before Mr. Hardwick noticed my reaction. He gave me the slightest of nods, as if confirming something he already knew. Lord Ashford was also quite interested in family members who had declined opportunities for personal advancement in order to serve others, he said. He found such choices particularly admirable in an age when most people seem motivated purely by self-interest. The family was staring at me now with expressions I couldn't quite read. confusion mixed with growing unease and perhaps the first stirrings of real fear. They were beginning to understand that this conversation was not going where they had expected, that their assumptions about both the will and their own positions in the family hierarchy might be catastrophically wrong. He wrote extensively about the concept of worthiness, Mr. Hardwick continued, about the difference between inheriting privilege and earning respect, about the responsibility that comes with genuine stewardship rather than mere ownership. Perhaps we could simply proceed with the reading of the will itself, Dominic suggested, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining control. Of course, Mr. Hardwick replied, placing his hand on the blue leather document. Though I should mention that Lord Ashford insisted I read one particular passage from his personal notes before we begin with the formal distribution. He lifted a single sheet of paper covered in Grandfather's handwriting, holding it so that the light from the Gothic windows illuminated the familiar script. Lord Ashford wrote, I have watched my family for many years, and I have seen the difference between those who honor our name and those who simply bear it. I have observed who builds and who merely consumes, who serves and who merely takes, who creates lasting value and who simply spends inherited wealth. The silence in the room was absolute now, broken only by the sound of wind rattling the ancient windows, and the distant tolling of the church bells in Ravenshollow village. It is time, Mr. Hardwick continued reading, to ensure that the Ashford legacy is placed in hands that will honor it rather than exploit it. It is time to reward character over connection, service over selfishness, and genuine achievement over inherited advantage. He set the paper down and looked around the table with an expression that had lost all pretense of neutrality. Now, he said, opening the blue leather will, shall we proceed with the formal reading? Mr. Hardwick opened the leather-bound will with the reverence of a priest opening a sacred text. The pages were thick, expensive paper that rustled softly in the sudden quiet of the room. I could see that the document was substantially longer than anyone had expected, dozens of pages rather than the brief, straightforward distribution they had all anticipated. The last will and testament of Aldric Theodore Ashford, 7th Earl of Ravenshollow, he began, his voice carrying the formal cadence that legal documents seemed to demand. Written in sound mind and body on the 15th day of March in the year of our Lord. Perhaps we could skip the formalities? Dominic interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. We're all family here. Mr. Hardwick looked at him over his spectacles with the kind of disapproving expression usually reserved for children who had spoken out of turn in church. Lord Ashford was quite specific about wanting the complete document read in its entirety. He felt the context was essential. He cleared his throat and continued. I, Aldric Theodore Ashford, having lived 94 years and having observed the full measure of human nature in both its nobility and its frailty, do hereby set forth my final wishes regarding the disposition of my earthly possessions. The formal language seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket, reminding everyone present that we were witnessing the final act of a man who had shaped our family for generations. Despite everything that had transpired, I felt a renewed pang of grief for Grandfather, for the quiet wisdom and gentle strength that had anchored our family for so long. I have been blessed in my life to accumulate substantial wealth, Mr. Hardwick continued reading, and I have watched with great interest how the knowledge of this wealth has affected the behavior and character of those around me. I have seen how the prospect of inheritance can corrupt the worthy and reveal the true nature of the unworthy. Aunt Beatrice shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming nervously against the mahogany table. I have observed that there are those who view family wealth as an entitlement to be claimed and those who view it as a responsibility to be earned. I have watched some family members serve others selflessly, while others have served only themselves. I have noted who has built something of value with their lives, and who has merely spent what others have built. The lawyer paused, allowing the words to sink in before continuing. It is my belief that wealth should flow to those who will use it wisely, not merely to those who happen to share my bloodline. I felt a flutter of something I didn't want to name. Hope, perhaps, or vindication. But I pushed it down, unwilling to let myself believe that Grandfather had seen what I had always hoped he might see. Therefore, Mr. Harwick continued, I have structured my bequests not according to traditional expectations or family hierarchy, but according to demonstrated character, proven integrity, and evidence of genuine service to others. Percival's phone slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the table with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. To my nephew Dominic Ashford Blackthorne, the lawyer read, who has shown such creativity in financial management, I leave the sum of £50,000, with the stipulation that it be used to repay the family trust funds that were improperly diverted to personal investments. The blood drained from Dominic's face so completely that I worried he might actually faint. 50,000? He whispered. But the estate is worth— To my niece Cordelia Ashford Pemberton, Mr. Harwick continued without pause, who has such an appreciation for fine art, I leave her personal collection, those pieces that were purchased with family funds, but somehow found their way into her private residences. She may keep them, along with the obligation to repay the educational trust fund that financed their acquisition. Cordelia made a small, strangled sound that might have been a protest, or simply an expression of shock. Her carefully applied makeup was beginning to smudge as perspiration beaded on her forehead. To my nephew, Percival Ashford Sterling, who has demonstrated such entrepreneurial spirit in creating consulting opportunities, I leave his consulting fees, those that have already been paid. No further payment will be made from family accounts for services rendered to enterprises that he and his wife conveniently controlled. Percival's face had taken on a grayish tinge that made him look suddenly ill. His wife's investment group had been counting on those family contracts to maintain their cash flow. Without them, they would be in serious financial trouble. To my daughter Beatrice, Countess of Valdoria, the lawyer continued, who has maintained such important international connections, I leave the sum of £100,000, with the understanding that all future diplomatic expenses will be paid from her personal funds rather than family accounts. Aunt Beatrice's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. 100,000? She gasped. Papa, that won't even cover my obligations for the next year. The Count is expecting. There are additional provisions, Mr. Harwick said, his voice cutting through her protests like a blade. Lord Ashford was quite specific about his reasoning for these decisions. He turned to a new section of the will, marked with a red ribbon that suggested particular importance. I do not make these decisions lightly, he read. I have loved my family, but I have also watched them transform from servants of our legacy into consumers of it. I have seen them mistake privilege for virtue and inheritance for achievement. I have watched them dismiss and belittle the one family member who has actually embodied the values upon which our fortune was built. My heart began to beat so hard I was certain everyone in the room could hear it. The silence had become so complete that even the sound of breathing seemed unnaturally loud. I have observed with growing admiration the work of my granddaughter Vivienne, Mr. Harwick continued, who chose service over comfort, impact over income, and genuine achievement over inherited advantage. While others in the family have spent their time managing the wealth I accumulated, she has spent her time creating wealth. Not financial wealth, but the kind of wealth that actually matters. Lives saved, families preserved, communities strengthened. Tears I hadn't expected began to blur my vision. Even in death, Grandfather had seen what I had always hoped someone in the family might see, that worth couldn't be measured solely in bank accounts and property values. She has turned a modest inheritance into something far more valuable than money, a program that has genuinely improved thousands of lives. She has leveraged private donations into government partnerships, created sustainable funding models, and built something that will outlast us all. She has, in short, done what I always hoped the Ashford name would represent. The lawyer paused, looking around the table at faces that ranged from stunned to horrified to devastated. More importantly, he continued reading, she has done all of this while enduring the casual dismissal and condescension of family members who have accomplished far less with far more. She has maintained her dignity and continued her work while being treated as the family failure by people who have actually been failing our family legacy for years. I could feel my cousin's eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at them. The mixture of vindication and grief was overwhelming. Vindication that Grandfather had understood, grief that he was no longer here to see how this moment would change everything. "She has proven," Mr. Hardwick read, his voice growing stronger, "that she understands what the rest of the family has forgotten, that true wealth lies not in what you accumulate, but in what you create, not in what you inherit, but in what you build, not in what you spend, but in what you give." The lawyer looked up from the document, his eyes meeting mine across the table with an expression of profound respect. "And therefore," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality, "it is to Vivienne that I entrust the future of our family legacy." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. I could feel the weight of destiny shifting in the room, like tectonic plates realigning beneath our feet. But he hadn't finished reading yet. Mr. Hardwick turned the page with deliberate ceremony, and I could see that the next section was marked with multiple ribbons: red, gold, and deep blue, the Ashford family colors. Whatever was coming next, Grandfather had wanted to ensure it received proper emphasis. "To my beloved granddaughter, Vivienne Ashford," the lawyer began, his voice taking on a tone of profound solemnity, "who has proven herself worthy of the Ashford name in ways that her relatives have forgotten were possible, I leave the following." The silence in the room was so absolute that I could hear the ancient floorboards creaking as the manor house settled around us. My family sat frozen, their faces masks of disbelief and growing horror as they began to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Thornfield Manor and all its contents, including the library of first editions, the art collection in the main galleries, and all furnishings, fixtures, and personal effects contained therein. I felt the world tilt around me. Thornfield Manor, the family seat, the crown jewel of the Ashford holdings, the property that had been in our family for over 2 centuries, was mine. The house that had seemed like a museum to me, the place where I had always felt like an outsider, would now be my responsibility to preserve and protect. The entire estate grounds, Mr. Hardwick continued, including the formal gardens, the tenant cottages, the stables, and all outbuildings, comprising approximately 800 acres in total. Dominic made a sound like he was choking. His face had gone from pale to a sickly green, and his hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "All properties in Scotland, including Glenmore Castle and its surrounding lands, the hunting lodge at Cairngorm, and the fishing rights to the River Spey." "This is impossible," Cordelia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Papa couldn't have. He wouldn't have." But Mr. Hardwick was far from finished. "All properties in Ireland, including Ashford Hall in County Cork, and the coastal estate at Killarney. The London properties," he continued, "including the townhouse in Belgravia, the Mews House in Kensington, and the commercial building in Mayfair." Percival's phone had started buzzing insistently on the table, but he seemed incapable of movement, staring at the lawyer as if he were witnessing some impossible natural phenomenon. "All investment portfolios, including but not limited to the gilt-edged securities, the equity portfolios managed by Pemberton and Associates, the government bonds, and the foreign currency holdings." The numbers were becoming almost meaningless in their enormity. I tried to process what I was hearing, but my mind seemed incapable of grasping the full scope of what was being described. "The fine art collection currently held in storage in London, valued at approximately £15 million. Aunt Beatrice let out a small, wounded cry. "The rare book collection housed at Sotheby's, the wine collection at Barry Bros and Rudd, and the jewelry collection currently held at Garrard and Company. All mineral rights associated with family properties, including the slate quarries in Wales and the gravel extraction rights in Yorkshire." Mr. Hardwick paused, reaching into his briefcase to withdraw what appeared to be a summary document. "Lord Ashford instructed me to provide a comprehensive valuation of these holdings as of the date of his death." He placed the document on the table where everyone could see it, though I noticed that his positioning ensured I had the clearest view. The total estimated value of the Ashford estate, he announced, is approximately £427 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. £427 million. More money than I could have imagined in my wildest dreams. More than most people could conceptualize. More than some small countries' entire annual budgets. 400. Dominic started to say, then stopped, his voice failing him completely. Million, Mr. Harwick confirmed. Though Lord Ashford noted that this figure is conservative, as several properties have not been revalued in recent years and are likely worth significantly more than their current assessments. I felt dizzy, as if the floor beneath my feet had suddenly become unstable. This wasn't just about inheriting a house or even substantial wealth. This was about becoming responsible for a financial empire that could influence markets, shape communities, and impact thousands of lives. But there's more, Mr. Harwick said, and I wondered how there could possibly be more. He withdrew another set of documents from his briefcase, these ones bearing official seals and ribbons that I didn't recognize. Lord Ashford also established several trusts and foundations in Miss Vivienne's name, to be administered at her discretion. The Ashford Foundation for Youth Development, with an initial endowment of £50 million, specifically created to support and expand programs like the one Miss Vivienne has built in Millbrook. My heart stopped. £50 million dedicated to the work I had been doing with modest donations and government grants. The programs we could create, the lives we could change, the communities we could transform. The possibilities were staggering. The Ashford Trust for Educational Innovation, endowed with £30 million, focused on creating scholarship opportunities for underprivileged students pursuing careers in social service. The Ashford Foundation for Community Development, with £20 million dedicated to supporting grassroots organizations working in underserved communities throughout Britain. Each new revelation felt like a physical blow. Grandfather hadn't just given me money. He had given me the tools to multiply the impact of everything I had been trying to accomplish. He had seen what I was building and provided me with the resources to build it on a scale I had never dared to imagine. In addition, Mr. Harwick continued, Miss Vivienne is named as the sole beneficiary of Lord Ashford's life insurance policies, totaling £15 million, and his personal accounts, currently holding approximately £8 million in liquid assets. The total immediate inheritance, he announced, consulting his summary document, is approximately £550 million, with additional assets that may appreciate significantly over time. The silence that followed was different from any we had experienced that morning. This wasn't the quiet of anticipation, or even the stillness of shock. This was the profound silence of a world that had been completely and irrevocably transformed. I looked around the table at my family's faces, seeing expressions I had never witnessed before. Dominic looked like he had been physically struck, his mouth hanging open in a way that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. Cordelia's carefully applied makeup was now streaked with tears she didn't seem to realize she was crying. Percival had gone completely gray, staring at the documents as if they might somehow change if he looked at them hard enough. Aunt Beatrice was clutching her pearls so tightly, I worried she might break the strand. But Mr. Harwick still wasn't finished. Lord Ashford was quite specific about wanting Miss Vivienne to understand both the magnitude of this responsibility and his confidence in her ability to handle it, he said, withdrawing one final document from his briefcase. He left a personal letter for you, Miss Ashford, he said, extending an envelope sealed with wax and bearing my name in Grandfather's careful handwriting. I took the letter with trembling hands, hardly able to believe that in the space of an hour I had gone from being the family's embarrassment to becoming one of the wealthiest women in Britain. Lord Ashford also left instructions, Mr. Harwick added, his voice taking on a note of what I could only describe as satisfaction, that the family's existing financial arrangements should be clarified. I looked up from the letter, meeting his eyes. Clarified how? His smile was sharp and entirely professional. All family members who have been receiving allowances, consulting fees, or other payments from estate accounts will need to renegotiate those arrangements directly with you. As the new owner of the estate, you will determine how family resources are distributed going forward. The power dynamic in the room shifted so completely and suddenly that I could almost feel the earth moving beneath our feet. Just hours ago, they had been planning my future, deciding what modest inheritance I might receive and how I should spend it. Now, suddenly, their own financial futures depended entirely on my goodwill. "You mean?" Cordelia started to say, then stopped. "I mean," Mr. Harwick said with obvious relish, "that Miss Vivienne now controls everything. Every trust fund, every family account, every property, every investment. The family's financial future is entirely in her hands." And with that, he closed the will and sat back in his chair, watching as the full implications of what had just transpired began to sink in around the table. I broke the wax seal on Grandfather's letter with trembling fingers, the weight of everything that had just transpired making my hands shake uncontrollably. The paper inside was the same expensive stationery he had always used, and the familiar scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and bergamot, rose from the pages like a ghost of his presence. "My dearest Vivienne," I read silently, though Mr. Harwick gestured for me to share it aloud. I cleared my throat, still struggling to process the magnitude of what had just happened. "My dearest Vivienne," I began again, my voice barely steady. "If you are reading this, then the reading of my will has proceeded exactly as I planned, and you are likely feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility I have placed upon your shoulders." I paused, looking around the table at my family's stunned faces. They seemed frozen in place, like figures in a tableau depicting the aftermath of some natural disaster. "I want you to know that this decision was not made lightly, or in haste. I have spent the last 15 years watching you build something remarkable from nothing, while watching the rest of our family consume what I built, without creating anything of lasting value in return." Dominic flinched as if he'd been slapped, but I continued reading. "You may wonder how I knew about the scope of your work when you were so modest about sharing your achievements. The truth is, I have been one of your anonymous donors for over a decade. Not just the modest contributions I mentioned to Mr. Harwick, but substantial funding that allowed you to expand your programs beyond what government grants alone could support." My breath caught in my throat. Some of our largest donations had come from sources we could never identify. Mysterious contributions that arrived at exactly the right moments to fund crucial expansions or weather budget crises. The new community center you opened last year? The scholarship fund that has sent 37 young people to university? The family counseling program that has reunited over 200 children with stable homes? I funded all of it because I wanted to see what you could accomplish when resources matched your vision. Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading. All those nights I had stayed awake worrying about funding. All those proposals I had written to foundations that never responded. All those times I had wondered if we could keep the programs running. And Grandfather had been there all along, quietly ensuring that we could continue our work. I also want you to understand the full scope of what you are inheriting, because the documents Mr. Harwick read today represent only the beginning. I looked up at the lawyer, who nodded encouragingly. The Ashford family has business interests that extend far beyond the properties and investments mentioned in the formal will. We own controlling stakes in 7 companies, minority interests in dozens more, and have strategic partnerships that generate substantial ongoing revenue. Mr. Harwick reached into his briefcase once more and withdrew a thick folder that he had apparently been saving for this moment. "Ashford Holdings Limited," he explained, opening the folder to reveal detailed financial statements, "is the umbrella corporation that manages the family's business interests. Miss Vivienne, you are now the sole owner and chairman of the board." He began laying out documents on the table, each one representing a different aspect of the business empire I had just inherited. The company owns 60% of Meridian Construction, which has government contracts worth over £50 million annually. 30% of Blackthorn Financial Services, which manages investment portfolios for some of Britain's wealthiest families. Controlling interest in Ravenshollow Properties, which owns commercial real estate throughout England and Scotland. The numbers were becoming abstract, too large for my mind to properly grasp, but Mr. Harwick wasn't finished. There are also the shipping interests, The Ashford family has owned shares in maritime transport companies for over a century. Currently, these holdings generate approximately £8 million in annual dividends. The technology investments, he continued, laying out another set of documents, include early stakes in several companies that have since become quite valuable. Lord Ashford was remarkably prescient about emerging markets. Percival's face had gone from gray to an alarming shade of purple. His own tech investments, which he had been so proud of that morning, suddenly seemed insignificant by comparison. The agricultural interests include not just the land holdings, but processing facilities, distribution networks, and retail partnerships. The Ashford name appears on products in supermarkets throughout Europe, though few people realize the connection. In total, Mr. Harwick said, consulting a summary document, the annual income generated by these various holdings is approximately £47 million after taxes and operational expenses. £47 million per year, more money than I had ever imagined existing, flowing in automatically from investments in businesses I had never known the family owned. But perhaps most importantly, I continued reading from Grandfather's letter, I want you to understand why I structured the inheritance this way. Your cousins and aunt have spent years treating our family wealth as their personal treasury, borrowing against future inheritances, charging personal expenses to family accounts, and generally behaving as if money were an unlimited resource with no connection to responsibility or accountability. I glanced up to see Dominic's hands clenched into fists on the table, his face a mask of barely controlled rage and humiliation. They have forgotten that wealth is not an end in itself, but a tool for creating something meaningful. They have confused having money with being valuable, possessing things with accomplishing things. You, on the other hand, have proven that you understand the true purpose of resources, to serve something larger than yourself. You took a modest inheritance. Yes, I left you some money when you turned 25, though you never knew it came from me, and you leveraged it into something that has genuinely improved thousands of lives. I remembered that inheritance, a small bequest from a distant relative that had allowed me to put a down payment on the building that became our first community center. I had never questioned where it came from, grateful simply that it had arrived when we needed it most. The foundations I have established in your name are not just about continuing your existing work, though that would be worthwhile enough. They are designed to allow you to transform your local success into a national model. The £50 million in the Youth Development Foundation could create programs like yours in every major city in Britain. The scope of possibility was staggering. Programs in London, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, reaching hundreds of thousands of at-risk youth instead of the few thousand we currently served. The Educational Innovation Trust is meant to address something you have often mentioned in your reports: the need for alternative pathways for young people who don't thrive in traditional academic settings. £30 million could fund vocational training programs, apprenticeships, and career development initiatives on a scale that could influence national policy. I thought of the countless teenagers I had worked with over the years, bright and capable young people who had been written off by the educational system simply because they learned differently or came from challenging backgrounds. The Community Development Foundation represents my belief that lasting change happens at the grassroots level, through people like you who understand that communities know their own needs better than distant bureaucrats. £20 million, properly distributed to local organizations, could create a network of community-led initiatives that would make Britain a more just and compassionate nation. Finally, I read, my voice growing stronger as I began to understand the full vision Grandfather had laid out. I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your ability to handle this responsibility. You have already proven that you can create sustainable, effective programs with limited resources. Now I am giving you unlimited resources, and I trust you to use them as wisely as you have used everything else you have been given. I looked up from the letter to find my family staring at me with expressions that ranged from shock to awe, to something that might have been fear. In the space of 2 hours, I had gone from being the family disappointment to controlling more wealth and power than any of them had ever imagined. There is one final surprise, I continued reading, that Mr. Harwick will share with you when you finish this letter. It concerns the international scope of our family's holdings, and it will, I think, help you understand just how far your influence could extend if you choose to use it. I finished reading and looked at Mr. Harwick, who was already reaching for yet another folder, this one marked with seals from what appeared to be foreign governments. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice taking on a tone of barely contained excitement, "your grandfather maintained business interests in 17 countries. You are now, quite possibly, one of the most influential private citizens in the Commonwealth." The weight of destiny settled around my shoulders like a mantle I had never asked for, but somehow always been meant to wear. Mr. Harwick opened the International Holdings folder with the careful precision of someone handling state secrets. The documents inside bore official seals from governments I recognized, and several I didn't, suggesting business relationships that spanned continents and crossed political boundaries. "The Ashford family's international portfolio," he began, "includes substantial holdings in Australia, Canada, South Africa, and New Zealand, mining rights, agricultural operations, and real estate development projects that generate significant revenue streams." I watched my family's faces as each new revelation landed like a physical blow. They had spent the morning treating me like a charity case, and now they were discovering that I controlled more wealth than some sovereign nations. "But before we continue," I said, setting Grandfather's letter carefully aside, "I think we need to address something." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Aunt Beatrice's labored breathing. She looked like she was on the verge of hyperventilating. "For years," I continued, my voice growing steadier with each word, "you have treated me like the family embarrassment. You've dismissed my work, patronized my choices, and assumed that because I lived modestly, I was somehow failing at life." Dominic opened his mouth as if to protest, but I held up a hand to stop him. "This morning, you spent considerable time planning how to divide an inheritance that wasn't yours to divide. You discussed firing loyal employees who have served this family for decades. You talked about me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected." I stood up from my chair, feeling the full weight of my new position settling around me like armor. "You, Dominic, borrowed against family trusts to finance your personal real estate ventures. You treated our grandfather's legacy like your personal bank account." His face flushed red with humiliation, but he couldn't deny what Mr. Harwick had already documented. "You, Cordelia, systematically looted family funds to build your personal art collection, then had the audacity to suggest that I didn't understand real responsibility." She was crying openly now, her carefully applied makeup streaking down her cheeks in dark rivulets. "Percival, you created fake consulting contracts to funnel family money to companies you secretly controlled, all while lecturing me about the difference between, quote, playing with other people's money and building real wealth." He hadn't looked up from the table since the reading began, his shoulders hunched in defeat. "And, Aunt Beatrice, you charged luxury vacations to family accounts while living a lifestyle funded entirely by Grandfather's generosity, then suggested I needed to learn about, quote, suitable positions in society." She finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Vivienne, darling, we never meant—" "You never meant what?" I asked, my voice sharp, with years of accumulated hurt. "You never meant to dismiss everything I'd accomplished? You never meant to treat me like a burden? You never meant to assume I was worthless simply because I chose service over self-aggrandizement?" The silence that followed was heavy with shame and recognition. For the first time in my life, I saw my family members as they truly were, not the sophisticated, successful figures they pretended to be, but people who had been living off inherited wealth while contributing nothing of value to the world. "Do you want to know what the real difference is between us?" I asked, walking slowly around the table. "It's not intelligence or capability or even opportunity. It's character." I stopped behind Dominic's chair. "When you had access to family resources, you used them to make yourself richer. When I had access to family resources I didn't even know came from Grandfather, I used them to make other people's lives better. When you saw wealth, you saw something to consume. When I saw wealth, I saw something to multiply through service. I moved to stand where everyone could see me clearly. When you had advantages, you used them to gain more advantages for yourselves. When I had advantages, I used them to create advantages for people who had none. Mr. Hardwick was watching this confrontation with what I could only describe as satisfaction, as if he had been waiting years to see this moment unfold. The most revealing part of this morning, I continued, wasn't learning about your financial improprieties, though those were certainly enlightening. It was watching how quickly you dismissed achievements that didn't fit your narrow definition of success. When Mr. Hardwick described a program that had received royal recognition, been featured in national media, and was being expanded nationwide, your first instinct was to minimize it because it involved helping poor children rather than managing rich people's money. Percival finally looked up. "We didn't know it was you." "That's exactly the point," I said. "You didn't know because you never bothered to ask." In 15 years of family gatherings, not one of you ever asked me what I actually did with my days. You simply assumed that because I wasn't flashing wealth around, I wasn't accomplishing anything meaningful. You were so convinced of your own superiority that it never occurred to you that someone could be successful without displaying the external markers you associate with achievement. I pulled out my phone and opened an app I rarely showed anyone, the dashboard that tracked our program statistics in real time. "This week alone," I said, turning the screen so they could all see it, "our programs have prevented 4 potential suicides, reunited 12 children with stable families, helped 18 people find employment, and provided emergency assistance to 37 families facing eviction. That's this week. Every week for the past 15 years, we've been quietly changing lives while you've been loudly managing portfolios." Cordelia wiped her eyes with a tissue that was already mascara-stained. "We're proud of your work, truly." "No," I said firmly, "you're not proud. You're embarrassed. You're embarrassed that the family member you dismissed as a failure has been more successful at the things that actually matter than any of you have ever been. You're embarrassed that while you were buying art with stolen money and charging vacations to family accounts, I was building something that will outlast all of us. You're embarrassed that when the history of the Ashford family is written, the chapter about our generation will focus on what I built, not on what you inherited." The truth of this hung in the air like a physical presence. Despite all their wealth and status and connections, none of them had created anything that would be remembered beyond their own lifetimes. "But most of all," I said, my voice growing quieter but more intense, "you're embarrassed because you realize that Grandfather saw what I've always known, that true worth has nothing to do with what you have and everything to do with what you do with what you have." I sat back down, but this time in Grandfather's chair at the head of the table. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. "So now we come to the question of what happens next," I said, looking around at faces that showed various combinations of shame, fear, and desperate hope. "You've all been living on family money for years. Your lifestyles, your properties, your business ventures, all of it has been subsidized by the estate that I now control." Dominic's hands were shaking. "Vivienne, please, we know we've made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I repeated. "Dominic, you embezzled over £2 million. That's not a mistake. That's a felony. Cordelia, you systematically stole from educational trusts meant to help disadvantaged students. Children who could have gone to university are still trapped in poverty because you needed a Monet for your bedroom. Percival, your consulting fraud cost the family estates millions in unnecessary expenses. Money that could have been used to maintain properties or support employees went instead to line your pockets. And Aunt Beatrice, your diplomatic expenses could have funded scholarships for hundreds of students instead of spa treatments in Valdoria." I let that sink in before continuing. "But here's what you don't understand," I said, leaning forward. "I'm not angry because you stole from the family. I'm angry because you stole from everyone the family could have helped. Every pound you diverted to your personal use was a pound that couldn't go toward creating jobs, funding education, supporting communities, or building something meaningful. You didn't just betray Grandfather's trust, you betrayed the trust of every person our family wealth could have served." Mr. Hardwick cleared his throat gently. "Miss Ashford, there are some practical matters we should discuss regarding the family's ongoing financial arrangements. I nodded, though I kept my eyes on my relatives' stricken faces. Indeed, I said, because as of today, everything changes. Mr. Harwick reached into his briefcase one final time and withdrew a folder marked Family Financial Obligations. The very existence of such a folder seemed to suggest that Grandfather had anticipated this moment and prepared for it with typical thoroughness. Lord Ashford was quite specific about how ongoing family financial arrangements should be handled, he said, opening the folder to reveal what appeared to be detailed spreadsheets and legal documents. He instructed me to provide Miss Vivienne with a complete accounting of all family members' current dependencies on estate funds. He began laying out documents that painted a stark picture of just how thoroughly my relatives had built their lives around inherited money rather than earned income. Mr. Dominic, he began, currently receives an annual allowance of £200,000 from the estate, plus housing allowances that cover the mortgage on his Kensington Heights penthouse and maintenance costs for his Jackson Hole property. Dominic's face went ashen. Without that allowance, his lifestyle would collapse overnight. Miss Cordelia receives £150,000 annually, plus a separate art acquisition budget of £200,000 that she has consistently exceeded by charging additional purchases to family accounts. Cordelia made a small choking sound. Her gallery openings, her art collection, her entire social identity was built around having access to virtually unlimited funds for cultural pursuits. Mr. Percival's consulting contracts have generated approximately £400,000 annually over the past 5 years, beyond his regular allowance of £100,000. Percival's technology ventures, I realized, weren't nearly as successful as he'd pretended. His real income came from the family money he'd been essentially stealing through fake contracts. Countess Beatrice has been receiving £300,000 annually, ostensibly from managing family interests in Europe, plus unlimited access to family accounts for travel and diplomatic expenses. Aunt Beatrice's lavish lifestyle in Valdoria, her status in European high society, her ability to move in aristocratic circles, all of it was funded by Grandfather's generosity, not by any wealth she or her husband had actually generated. In total, Mr. Harwick concluded, the family has been receiving approximately £1,200,000 annually in various allowances, salaries, and expenses, not including the unauthorized charges that have been documented. The number hung in the air like an accusation. More than £1 million every year, flowing to people who had contributed nothing to earning it and had consistently betrayed the trust that made it possible. Now, I said, my voice steady despite the enormity of what I was about to do, let me be very clear about how things will work going forward. I stood up again, feeling the full weight of my new authority settling around me like a cloak. All allowances are terminated, effective immediately. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the wind whistling through the eaves of the old manor house. All consulting contracts are voided. All expense accounts are closed. All credit cards linked to family accounts are canceled. Aunt Beatrice let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Dominic, you have 30 days to arrange alternative financing for your properties. If you can't manage that, you'll need to sell them. 30 days? He whispered. But the mortgage alone is not my responsibility, I finished. You leveraged family assets to purchase properties you couldn't afford with your own income. That was your choice. Cordelia, you have 60 days to return all artwork purchased with family funds or to arrange personal financing to purchase them at fair market value. Return them? She asked, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. But they're part of my collection. They're in my home. They were never yours to begin with, I said firmly. They were purchased with money stolen from educational trusts. Either return them so they can be sold to fund scholarships, or buy them legitimately with your own money. Percival, your wife's investment group will need to find new clients, since the family accounts that provided the bulk of their business will no longer be available. He looked up at me with something approaching desperation. Vivienne, those contracts represent millions in ongoing revenue. Revenue that was never legitimately yours, I replied. You created those contracts to funnel family money to yourselves. Now you'll have to survive on your actual business abilities. And Aunt Beatrice, I continued, turning to face her directly, your allowance of £300,000 per year could have funded full university scholarships for 30 students annually. Since you chose to spend it on luxury vacations instead, those 30 students will now get their chance. She was crying openly now. Her carefully constructed, aristocratic demeanor completely collapsed. But darling, you don't understand. The Count's family expects a certain standard. Then perhaps the Count's family should pay for that standard themselves, I said. Or perhaps you should have thought about that before you spent 15 years treating my grandfather's generosity as your personal entitlement. Mr. Aldric was taking notes as I spoke, clearly prepared to implement these decisions immediately. There will be no appeals process, I continued. No gradual transitions or partial allowances. You've had years to build independent income sources, and instead you chose to increase your dependency on family money while treating the source of that money with contempt. But what are we supposed to do? Cordelia asked, her voice breaking. How are we supposed to live? I looked at her with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been mixed with so much accumulated frustration. You're supposed to do what millions of other people do every day, I said. You're supposed to work. You're supposed to earn money through your own efforts. You're supposed to live within your means instead of above them. You have educations from the finest schools in Britain. You have connections throughout business and society. You have every advantage that privilege can provide. The only thing you lack is experience actually using those advantages to create value instead of simply consuming it. This is vindictive, Dominic said, his voice rough with emotion. You're punishing us for what? I interrupted. For stealing? For embezzling? For treating our family legacy like your personal treasure chest? For dismissing and belittling me for 15 years while living off money that I now know was funding the very work you mocked? I'm not punishing you, I continued. I'm simply refusing to continue subsidizing your irresponsible behavior. But there is one alternative, I added, watching their faces light up with desperate hope. You can earn your way back into my good graces. How? Aunt Beatrice asked immediately. By proving that you understand what service actually means. By demonstrating that you can contribute something meaningful to the world, instead of just consuming resources. I walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where Tobias was tending to the gardens he had maintained for over 3 decades. The Ashford Foundation for Youth Development will be hiring staff to manage programs nationwide. The positions pay well, but they require actual work. Real responsibility for real results. The Community Development Foundation will need administrators who can identify and support grassroots organizations. It means traveling to places that aren't luxury resorts and working with people who aren't wealthy or connected. The Educational Innovation Trust will require program directors who can develop and implement new approaches to helping disadvantaged students succeed. I turned back to face them. These are real jobs with real expectations. You would be evaluated based on measurable outcomes, not family connections. You would have to prove your worth through your contributions, not your bloodline. If any of you want to apply for these positions, you're welcome to submit applications like any other candidate. But you'll be competing with people who have dedicated their lives to this work, and you'll be held to the same standards they are. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers, except it was a lifeline that required them to learn how to swim. Otherwise, I said, returning to my chair, you have my best wishes for your future endeavors. I'm sure you'll find that the real world can be quite educational for people who have never had to navigate it independently. Mr. Aldric cleared his throat. There are some additional legal matters we should address, particularly regarding the return of misappropriated funds and the potential for criminal charges. The color drained from Dominic's face once again. In all their panic about losing their allowances, they had apparently forgotten that their actions hadn't just been unethical, they had been illegal. However, I said before the lawyer could continue, I'm willing to handle those matters privately, assuming full restitution is made and certain conditions are met. I could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. weighing the humiliation of starting over against the very real possibility of prosecution and imprisonment. "We'll need some time to consider our options," Dominic said carefully. "Of course," I replied. "Take all the time you need. But remember that your allowances stop immediately, regardless of what you decide about the employment opportunities." As I began to file out of the room in stunned silence, I realized that this was only the beginning. The real work of rebuilding our family's relationships, of managing unprecedented wealth responsibly, of scaling up my programs to help millions instead of thousands, was just starting. But for the first time in my life, I felt truly equipped to handle whatever came next. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated East Wing of Thornfield Manor, watching the first cohort of national program directors present their quarterly reports. The room that had once housed Grandfather's private study now served as the main conference center for the Ashford Foundation for Youth Development, its walls lined with charts showing the expansion of our programs across Britain. The transformation had been remarkable. What started as a single program in Millbrook now operated in 47 cities, serving over 30,000 at-risk youth annually. The methodology we had refined over 15 years was proving just as effective on a national scale, with some regional programs reporting even better outcomes than our original pilot sites. The Manchester program has achieved a 92% success rate in preventing repeat offenses, reported Dr. Sarah Chen, our new regional director for Northern England. We've also established partnerships with local employers that have resulted in permanent job placements for 68% of program participants. I smiled, remembering how Grandfather would have appreciated the precision of these metrics. He had always believed that good intentions without measurable results were merely expensive sentimentality. "The funding model is performing even better than projected," added James Morrison, our chief financial officer, a brilliant young man I'd recruited from Oxford, who had turned down more lucrative offers in the city to join our work. "The combination of foundation grants, corporate partnerships, and government matching funds has created a sustainable revenue stream that could support expansion to every major urban center in Britain within 5 years." As the presentations continued, I found myself thinking about how different this room felt from that morning 6 months ago, when my family had gathered to claim their expected inheritance. The energy here was focused, purposeful, driven by the knowledge that every decision we made would directly impact thousands of vulnerable young lives. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Whitmore, who still managed the household staff at Thornfield, despite my repeated offers to increase her salary. "Miss Vivienne, your cousin Cordelia is here to see you. Shall I show her to the library?" I stepped out of the conference room and found Cordelia waiting in the morning sunlight that streamed through the tall windows of what had once been Grandfather's favorite reading spot. She looked different, thinner, certainly, but also somehow more substantial. The designer clothes had been replaced by a simple wool dress and practical shoes, and her hair was pulled back in a style that suggested function over fashion. "Vivienne," she said, standing as I entered. "Thank you for seeing me." "Of course," I replied, gesturing for her to sit. "How are you managing?" She laughed, though there was no bitterness in it. "Better than I expected, actually. It's been illuminating to discover what I'm actually capable of when I have to rely on my own efforts." Over the past 6 months, Cordelia had surprised everyone, perhaps most of all herself. After initially struggling with the loss of her allowance, she had eventually applied for a position with the Educational Innovation Trust. Her application had been thorough, thoughtful, and demonstrated a genuine understanding of the challenges facing disadvantaged students. "I wanted to show you this," she said, pulling out a tablet and opening what appeared to be a presentation. "The arts therapy program we've been piloting in South London." I watched as she walked me through the data, explaining how creative expression had become a pathway for helping traumatized children process their experiences and develop coping skills. The program was serving 200 students across 5 schools, with remarkable improvements in both academic performance and emotional stability. The breakthrough came when I realized that my knowledge of art history and technique could actually serve a purpose beyond collecting, she explained. These children have never been to a gallery or seen an original painting, but they have stories to tell and emotions that need expression. The program coordinator position you offered me, I thought it would be a step down from my previous life. But watching a 12-year-old discover that she can create something beautiful, something that helps her make sense of trauma she couldn't even articulate before, it's more meaningful than anything I accomplished in my previous 43 years. I felt a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the morning sunlight. This was what Grandfather had envisioned, not punishment for past mistakes, but transformation through purposeful work. There's something else, Cordelia continued, her voice taking on a note of nervous excitement. The Department of Education has asked us to present our model to the Parliamentary Committee on Child Welfare. They're considering funding expansion to every secondary school in England. The scope of possibility was staggering. If arts therapy became a standard component of education for disadvantaged children, we could be affecting hundreds of thousands of young lives every year. Cordelia, that's extraordinary, I said, meaning it completely. I know we can never go back to the way things were, she said quietly. And honestly, I don't want to. I spent so many years acquiring things, art, status, connections, but I never built anything. I never created value or made anyone's life better. She paused, looking around the library where we used to gather for those painful family meetings. I understand now why Grandfather left everything to you. You were already doing with limited resources what the rest of us couldn't do with unlimited ones. A knock at the library door interrupted our conversation. Mrs. Whitmore appeared with her usual perfect timing. Miss Vivienne, Mr. Dominic is here as well. And Mr. Percival. They're in the drawing room with some gentlemen from the Community Development Foundation. I raised an eyebrow at Cordelia, who smiled. We've been working together more than you might expect. I found Dominic and Percival deep in conversation with Marcus Wright, our foundation's regional coordinator for rural development programs. Like Cordelia, both of my cousins looked different, not just physically, though they'd clearly been getting more exercise and less rich food, but in some fundamental way that suggested they discovered reserves of character they hadn't known they possessed. Vivienne, Dominic said, standing as I entered. Perfect timing. We were just discussing the feasibility study for the Highlands Initiative. Over the past 4 months, Dominic had been leading an effort to bring community development programs to some of Scotland's most isolated regions. His background in real estate, it turned out, was actually quite valuable when applied to understanding housing needs, infrastructure challenges, and economic development opportunities in underserved communities. The preliminary findings are remarkable, Percival added, consulting a tablet filled with charts and graphs. We've identified 47 communities that could benefit from targeted investment in local businesses, educational resources, and infrastructure improvements. More importantly, Dominic continued, we've found ways to structure the funding so that communities maintain ownership and control of their development programs. No outside investors swooping in to extract profit, just sustainable support that builds local capacity. I listened as they outlined their proposal, impressed despite myself by the thoroughness of their research and the sophistication of their approach. These were the same men who 6 months ago had been living off family money while creating fake consulting contracts and charging personal expenses to estate accounts. The total investment required would be approximately £8 million over 5 years, Marcus explained. But the projected outcomes include sustainable job creation for over 2,000 people, and economic development that would continue generating benefits long after our initial funding period ends. What changed? I asked them directly. 6 months ago, you were primarily concerned with maintaining your own lifestyle. Now you're proposing to spend years working in remote Scottish villages. What happened? Dominic and Percival exchanged a look that suggested they'd been anticipating this question. We got tired of being embarrassed by our own lives, Dominic said simply. For years, I told myself that managing investment portfolios was important work. But the truth is, I was just moving money around to generate more money for people who already had too much. The first week after you cut off our allowances, Percival added, I spent every day panicking about how I was going to maintain my lifestyle. Then I realized that my lifestyle wasn't actually worth maintaining. When we started working on these community development projects, Dominic continued, we discovered something we'd never experienced before. The satisfaction of building something that actually matters to people's daily lives. As the afternoon progressed, I learned about Aunt Beatrice's work establishing sister city partnerships between British communities and municipalities in developing nations, creating cultural exchange programs that provided educational opportunities for young people on both sides of the Atlantic. Each of my family members had found ways to apply their privileged educations and connections to serve others, rather than simply serving themselves. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still moments of adjustment, still occasional complaints about the physical demands and emotional challenges of their new work. But it was genuine. As evening approached and my cousins prepared to return to their respective programs, Cordelia lingered in the foyer of Thornfield Manor. "Do you think Grandfather would have been proud?" she asked. I considered the question carefully, thinking about the man who had built our family's fortune through hard work and strategic thinking, who had watched us all grow up, who had made the difficult decision to restructure his legacy around character rather than bloodline. "I think," I said finally, "he would have been proud that you all discovered you were capable of more than you knew. And I think he would have been especially proud that it took losing everything to help you find yourselves." Later that night, I stood in Grandfather's former study, now my office, reviewing reports from programs across the country. The numbers were staggering. 63,000 young people served, 47 cities with active programs, hundreds of families stabilized, thousands of lives redirected toward hope and opportunity. But the number that meant the most to me was smaller and more personal. 4 family members who had rediscovered their capacity for meaningful work, who had transformed from entitled consumers of inherited wealth into genuine contributors to human welfare. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Helena Morrison from Millbrook County. "Vivienne," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I just got off the phone with the Minister of Health. The national expansion has been approved. Full funding for 5 years, with an option to extend based on outcomes." I felt the familiar surge of purpose that had driven me for 15 years, now amplified by resources that could transform it from a local success story into a national model for social change. "There's more," Helena continued. "They want to invite you to present the British model to the European Union's Social Policy Committee. Apparently, several member nations are interested in adapting our approach." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Grandfather's vision had been even larger than I'd understood. He hadn't just wanted to redirect family wealth toward meaningful purposes. He had wanted to create a new model for how privilege and resources could serve society rather than simply perpetuating themselves. Looking out at the grounds of Thornfield Manor, where lights twinkled in the windows of the staff cottages that now housed program coordinators and visiting researchers, I understood that this was just the beginning. The Ashford legacy would no longer be measured by the wealth we accumulated, but by the lives we transformed. Not by what we inherited, but by what we built. Not by our ability to consume resources, but by our capacity to multiply them through service. And sometimes, the most profound inheritance isn't money at all. It's the opportunity to discover who you really are when everything else is stripped away, and the chance to build something worthy of the values you claim to hold. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told that your dreams weren't practical enough, remember this: true wealth isn't what you have, it's what you do with what you have. Success isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give people is not what they want, but what they need to become who they're capable of being. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. Legacy is what keeps growing long after you're gone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.